Welcome to But What About Me, a career success podcast dedicated to giving a voice to underrepresented populations, or UPs, and helping each navigate their career to reach their highest potential. This podcast is brought to you by JenniferTardy.com. Welcome back to another episode of But What About Me? I'm your host, Jennifer Tardy. Today's guest is the magnificent Chris Castillo, a millennial expert. Now, Chris helps millennials shake that Monday morning blues by directing them towards their purpose so they can feel empowered. In this episode, Chris and I talk about a lot of things. We talk about how millennials can navigate negative stereotypes. We talk about how to communicate effectively with your parents when you feel judged. We answer the question, is job hopping bad? We also talk about how to choose a path when you're interested in so many things. And then what about when you're a millennial and a manager, especially when you're managing people who are in generations before you? And we also talk about how to assess a company when we are clearly in a job seeker's market. Now, let me say, if you find this episode resonating with you at any point, do me a favor, take a screenshot and share it on Instagram for a friend that may also be asking the question, but what about me? Don't forget that when you share it, tag us on Instagram at Your Career Success. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Chris. Chris is the founder of Empowered Achievers, a career coaching and development company focused on helping ambitious women craft careers they love. Originally coming from the corporate advertising industry where she worked with big names like Google, YouTube, and Expedia, she traded in the agency life for the world of talent development and culture. She transformed her own career into something that she loved and is passionate about getting rid of the Sunday scaries for each one of her clients too. Chris works with individuals and companies alike through both her custom coaching programs as well as corporate trainings. She was recently voted one of the best millennial career experts by People Maven. Chris is a thought leader with articles in Thrive Global and features on sites such as Business News Daily and Hello Giggles. You can learn more about Empowered Achievers at beempoweredachievers.com. Millennials, this episode is all about you, so don't go anywhere. Let's get started. Well, hello, Chris, and thank you for being a part of But What About Me? So welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Not a problem at all. And when I heard that you were going to be on the show, I was really excited because I was mentioning to you a second ago, we are talking about one of my favorite subjects. And we'll get to why it's my favorite subject in a few minutes. But for those who may, let's say, be living under a rock, can you please share what a millennial is? Who are millennials?
Yeah. So millennials, typically, the age range that we're talking about, and actually a Pew research just came out, I think it was like 22 to 34, something like that. But essentially it's the age range of the young workers that we're kind of talking about today, that have all kinds of things associated with them, mostly avocado toast and things like that. But yeah, that's who millennials are, is the young range workforce.
Okay. And for some reason, anytime I'm in a room somewhere and someone brings up millennials, it's like they are getting a bad rap. But there are a lot of people who are just saying they're misunderstood, right? Uh-huh. So can you talk a little bit about what sort of stereotypes people have about millennials?
Oh my gosh, so many. So I'm definitely in the camp of millennials are terribly misunderstood, which is sad. But I think But I think some of the biggest things, the big ones that I typically hear are, the big one is millennials are selfish or entitled, or they got too many trophies as kids, and so now they all want to be CEO and not have to do any work, which I actually don't buy for a lot of reasons. But I think it also kind of goes hand in hand with the other big one that is often talked about, which is millennials are such job hoppers. They have no loyalty. They don't care that much about their work. They just, as I mentioned, avocado toast, but there is a ridiculous article by, I think it was an Australian CEO or something, who was talking all about how all of millennials' economic issues came from buying too much fancy toast. And people were like, well, there's a whole slew of issues with that statement. Yeah, a lot of them. But it's mostly stuff like that millennials are selfish, or they don't appreciate what they have, or they want too much, and they're job hoppers, they're unreliable, and don't want to have to work for it, essentially, is the gist of the rap.
Very interesting. And that's a lot of what I hear whenever it comes up, right?
Yeah.
And when you're coaching them, how are you helping them to navigate some of this? But let me even take it a step back first. Yeah. What are some truths, right? Now that we're demystifying some of these stereotypes, what are some truths, and how do you help millennials navigate through some of these stereotypes?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things, addressing all of those pieces of some of these misconceptions around entitlement and stuff like that, I would always argue that I think millennials actually care more about their jobs because they're willing to find something that they really care about. And this is the way that they find stability. So there's a really, really great book by Aaron Hurst called The Purpose Economy. And I mention it often because in it, he talks about the idea of there have been all these times in society, like he's like, it's like the Industrial Revolution and things are starting to change. And he argues that there's this new wave of focus on purpose and career fulfillment and roles. And what he mentions, which I agree and makes a lot of sense in my mind, is that a lot of millennials graduated at a time when, during the recession, when they realized that there wasn't necessarily the economic stability that there once was. And so while their parents might have stayed in roles for 40 odd years, millennials are realizing, hey, wait, like I might not have that same pension. The company who I thought was always going to be there for me doesn't have that same loyalty to me. And so for them, instead of stability and financial stability, they've instead replaced it with purposeful work and made that their stability of saying, well, if I don't know that this company is going to be there for me forever, I'm going to look out for myself and I'm going to make sure I'm doing work that I really care about. So that's, I think, a lot of what it comes from. But in terms of squashing that misconception, I would always argue that I think millennials, to me, it actually signifies that they care a lot about their work because they're not willing to settle. They want to do something that they're going to give 110% of themselves to and show up every day. So there's definitely, I don't think, underwork.
So, and I also agree with that too, but how do you help them to navigate?
Yeah. So, well, I think in terms of mindset, which is that whole thing about what you believe around the world around you, that can kind of become this, well, I should be doing this, or some of those pressures of, that is one that comes up with a lot of my clients is, well, I want to be able to do X, Y, and Z or change jobs or do this thing, but I'm scared that I'm going to get called just another millennial. And so actually, in order to address those things, you have to look at, for any mindset stuff, you have to look at where it came from, how it got supported, how believing that serves you, why you've kept that around so long, how it doesn't serve you, and then kind of look at and say, okay, what's the healthier way I want to look at this thing? But you have to really take the time to unpack it and unwind what's behind it. Because if you have any sort of realization about, like, I think this about myself and I wish I didn't, you can't just will it away and be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to tell myself I don't believe that anymore. Like, it does not work that way, or there would be a lot more well-adjusted people in this world.
A lot more.
A lot. So yeah, that's how I would always say to actually address that piece, is looking at where it comes from, because your brain's kind of like a balance sheet, right? If you have a lot of proof, I often say, use the example of, like, if you grew up thinking in a family where your parents had always told you that the world was flat, everything that you saw would then support that. You'd be like, well, look at the horizon, it's flat. Mm-hmm. So your brain is like a balance sheet. If you realize that you believe something you don't think is really necessarily additive to your life, you have to balance out counterproof, so to speak.
What are the truths, right? That makes sense.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about me, for instance. But what about me? Now, I'm also a millennial. I'm considered one of those millennials on the cusp. And this is why I'm really excited about this topic today. And I know, just in talking to other people who are my age as well, that there are a lot of things that are not true to those of us who are on the cusp. So because there's still that stigma, how would you, how do you help them, or how do you empower them to say, hey, you've got this, you're a millennial, but here's how you can navigate.
Yeah. Well, I think no one likes that stigma, whether you're on the cusp, whether you're on either end of it, or like I am pretty much smack dab in the middle of that situation. And yet for me, there's still the stigma. And I think a lot of people feel it. And until you know to anticipate it, right now, it doesn't necessarily faze me as much because I know that these are the things I'm going to hear. Mm-hmm. And so the reactive moment where I'm like, what? How dare they? Has gotten smaller and smaller. But the reality is, yeah, and it is totally fair to feel frustrated or offended by that. But I think that the important thing to remember there is always people's responses don't say very much about you, and they mostly say a lot about them. Mm. And so I think the best thing that I will often say to people is all you can really do is kind of look at it with as much compassion as possible and think about, wow, this is, I have clients who have told their parents, oh, I'm going through coaching and I'm starting to kind of figure out what I want to do next. And I've had one client in particular, we practiced this conversation multiple times. She recorded it to me and sent it to me so I could give her some feedback. She was so nervous to have this conversation with her parents because she knew exactly what they were going to say, which is, well, I don't like my job that much and I still pushed through it and I was able to support this life. And so typically those responses, although they come from so much love, often are, some of those unrequited dreams that other people haven't followed. And so all you can do is know that you'll probably get that stigma, be strong enough in who you are to be okay with that and be ready for it, but also recognize that sometimes those reactive responses come from people's own stuff. I guess is the way to say it.
And Chris, you mentioned something that I have to dive more deeply into.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about this, but there's going to be someone listening to this that's going to say, oh my goodness, she started talking about my parents. So let's talk about this whole notion of helicopter parents. Let's dive a little bit more deeply into it because oftentimes we started seeing the whole helicopter parent around the millennial generation, right? So let's go a little bit deeper into what you were just saying. So let's set up the situation. We have a person that their parents, for whatever reason, maybe they just want to live vicariously through their child. They're saying that you need to do things the way that I did it in my generation, right? Tell me more about that situation and how you're helping them to have those courageous and how often do you see the need for people to have this conversation with their parents?
Yeah. So in terms of this conversation, it totally depends on the dynamic. Some folks, their parents are in the loop from the beginning. They might not totally understand all of it, but they're trying their best to be supportive. Other cases, it's very much the one who I mentioned before. The reason that I knew we had to have that conversation in that way was that we were kind of at the point where I realized it's like, you can't move forward until you have this conversation with them, because we were talking about her looking for new opportunities, and she was saying it came up that she was like, well, I haven't actually told my parents that I was looking. And I was like, what? Time out. Hold on. What's going on here? Right. Why haven't you told them? And after we talked about it a little bit, there was this realization that for her, she wasn't going to be able to move forward until she did, because she was going to, as much as she said she wanted this new role, she was kind of doing little actions to maybe slow the process down a little bit. She's like, well, when I actually get this job, I'm going to have to tell them. So one, it depends on the situation, but that was for her. When you know it, you're like, this conversation has to happen because you're not able to move forward until it does. So that's when you know you got to talk about it. But in terms of the people how to actually have this conversation, the best thing I can say is a lot of millennials get advice from their parents, a lot of whom have been at their roles for a very long time. Right. I know my dad was at his job for I think 37 years or something before he retired.
My dad. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's super common. And again, all advice is well-intentioned. But sometimes I'll say, you know, parents always want what's good for you, but sometimes that's not what's best for you. So what I mean by that is sometimes they want to keep you safe, they want to keep you stable, and even though the bigger risk could have some of the bigger rewards, they sometimes don't want to steer you down that course. And so that's when you know it's time to have the conversation, to answer the first piece of your question. The second piece is all about how to actually have that, which really the best thing I can say is you are an adult. And it's challenging.
Ding, ding, ding.
It's challenging, but it's really the idea of changing dynamics. And it's going to be a little uncomfortable. And so practicing for a big conversation like you would for an interview. How do I want to get it across? How can I actually convey to them, here's what hasn't been working, here's what I'm trying to have, and here's what I'm doing as a result of it, opposed to just diving right into like, hey, I'm getting help for this, and here's why, because you haven't taken them through some of the pain and the frustration you felt. But also practice it. And remember, it might be weird if you've never done this before. You know, I lost my mom when I was 26, and we went to, my dad's sister and I went to a therapist with the three of us once to kind of have a conversation about how things were going to be different. And she mentioned an analogy, which I really like to use here, which is like, it's like the idea of a mobile, and you take one piece off and the rest of you kind of rebalance. Even though it's not a loss of a person in this conversation, it's the same kind of concept. You're taking up a slightly different role, and it kind of makes this mobile be like, whoa, 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 how do we feel about this? You've never responded that way to us before. So practice, and also be ready for the minute that it's going to be a little funky when your parents are trying to say, wait a second, we're not used to you saying like, I love you, I super appreciate your advice, and here's what I'm going to do because this is what I know I need to do. That's a little weird at first.
Yeah, but eventually you built that muscle, and you just
exactly.
It easier.
Exactly. It's a muscle. It's a muscle. You got to train it.
Right. So we were talking a second ago about tenure and how other generations or generations previous to millennials have worked longer tenured jobs. I'd love to know your thoughts around the whole concept of job hopping. And do you see it differently, or do you define it differently with your audience, the audience of people that you're coaching?
So in terms of what job hopping is, or how we look at it?
Both, in terms of what it is and if it's a good or bad thing. Like, should we reshape the definition of it and whether it's good or bad?
Got it. Okay, yeah. So I would say in terms of job hopping, to me, I don't think it's inherently wrong. I don't think anything necessarily is. But the important part is to look at what is this thing that keeps happening, right? So if it's really short stints and it's constantly changing, then you probably want to scratch a little bit under the surface and say what's really going on. Right. Because oftentimes, if it is the hop to hop to hop to hop, it might mean, sometimes what I've seen, again, not all the time, but sometimes it's more about what you're doing opposed to how you're doing it. So people try and often solve these problems by saying, it's my manager, it's my team, or if this one thing was fixed. But really, you know, I always group concerns into those two buckets. If it's concerned with what you're doing as a whole, I don't feel fulfilled by this type of work, you can solve the how all day long, and the what's not gonna, you're still gonna have this concern. So again, I don't think job hopping is inherently wrong. I think a lot of times it shows people's, you know, being a seeker's market and all of these things, knowing that there are high standards for things. And I think people are realizing that they can start to expect that. And I think that that's really great. And I think it propels a lot of companies forward into having to do things or being, maybe not being able to do things that they once could. And I think that that's a really wonderful thing. So again, don't think it's inherently wrong, but if it's a common reoccurring thing and you're starting to take roles because you just really want to get out of the last one, that's when you kind of have to like look a little further and be like, oh, whoa, what's really going on here?
Yeah, and do you oftentimes dive deeper that way when do you look for patterns and dive deeper with your clients as well?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the big piece of mindset. What's the thing that keeps happening that you keep saying your ideal is one thing, and then the reality that keeps happening is very different? If it happens time and time and time again, Commentary is no longer the company.
Right. Let's look within now. Let's look within.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned something about really doing what you want to do, which leads me into the whole notion of purpose. So oftentimes, I think we're moving into more of a purposeful space where people are looking and searching for their purpose, but they also have lots of skill sets, right? How do you help a millennial hone like all of those skills that they may have and connect it to purpose, if it's something that you do?
Yeah, so that's I have like 5 core elements that's just kind of is helpful to explain to people when we're actually going through, okay, here's where you go with the work. But the first piece of every program, all of my Career Clarity Camp, which is my group programming, that is the majority of the work I do with all my one-on-one clients, the first thing we always do, regardless of it, is getting clear on who you are and what you're about. And that's that purpose element of what is it that motivates me? What do I love? What am I gravitating towards? And so getting clear on that is the first really crucial step, because you're right. Until you get clear on who you are, what you're motivated by, who you are at your best is what I will always say is that's where we want to look at with your purpose statement is here's who I am at my best, so that all of your decisions, instead of saying, the mistake a lot of people make is saying, I'm going to do this thing by the time I'm this age and da 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 da. And instead of, they get so controlling that if any of those steps change or if they realize they no longer want that, world bottoms out under you. And so instead, replacing that with, you don't want the other end, which is ultimate chaos and saying, well, I have no direction. So instead saying, okay, every decision I make is moving me towards being me at my best. That becomes your new kind of end goal, that purpose statement that we work on. But yeah, that's a huge first piece that I work on with everyone, because if you don't take time to do that, then you make a lot of reactive, not so good decisions.
Okay. Perfect. And so millennials continue to hear the message of knowing yourself first. Now, I know that you said that one of the things that you do is like you want them to be able to know themselves first, but can you connect it? How does that help you to become better? Maybe that goes into like one of your other steps.
Yeah. So again, once you've gotten clear on the first piece, then you move into that next piece, which is, okay, of the many opportunities, right? Because when people are feeling overwhelmed, often they'll do this thing of like collecting a dream job list, where they'll say to me, oh, well, I could stay on the agency side, or I could go to the client side, or I could start a flower shop, or I could da-da-da-da. Whoa. Like,
right. I can see that easily.
Yeah. It's a very compelling place to be. And I get it. Before I moved into talent development, when I was in media originally, I definitely was in that place where I was like, there's so many things I could do. I want to pursue all of them. I'm multi-passionate, which you can be. And yet you can kind of get clear on, if you don't close any of the other doors, you can't walk through the one that you're going to walk through. So close it for now, knowing that you can always decide again. Because just because you've made a decision doesn't mean you can't decide again. But to answer your question of how does knowing yourself kind of lend itself to a role, because all of your decisions will then have to ladder up to which is going to kind of allow me to do most of those things that I'm drawn to. Because that's how you have a career that's fulfilling. It's not inherently altruistic, which is a really common misconception people have of like, well, to do a career that's fulfilling, then I have to be a doctor or whatever that might be. It doesn't have to be in that way. It's more so, what are your specific needs and what is a career that can meet those? So for me, having an individual, one-on-one impacts with people, being able to see the light in their eyes of realizing something that they didn't know how to do before. Those are all really big motivating factors for me. And so it's no wonder that that's the work that I do. So that's why we start with that getting clear on who you are, because then it kind of ladders into what kind of job is going to allow you to do those things as much as possible. It's just a lot of small steps towards doing more of that.
Okay. And thank you for explaining that too. Thank you. I have a really juicy question, and I could not wait to get to this question.
Okay, let's do it.
Now, a millennial being promoted into leadership, right? So going back to everything that we were talking about before, how, there are stigmas around, who millennials are and what they can contribute. So now think of millennials who are like, yep, I'm ready to be a leader. I'm ready to go into management, maybe even, senior leadership. What are some of those barriers that they face, and what sort of conversations are you having with them, whether they're trying to get into it or whether they're in it?
So I think I was actually on a call earlier today where a woman mentioned, she was like, yeah, well, I keep talking about the ways I want to advance, and it's super frustrating because the company keeps saying stuff along the lines of like, well, you have so much of your career ahead of you to do that.
Right.
Again,
How many times have you heard that? Yes, I've heard, and I've seen a lot of people that have heard that exact same thing.
Yeah, it's not fun. It's not not a great thing to hear when you're like, what? So I think if you're trying to actually advance somewhere and you're told that you're not there yet, learn from it, right? Because I think it can also be really compelling to be like, well, forget you, I'm going to go somewhere else where they care about me.
I'm right. Like, I'm leaving.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So I think that can be compelling. I think it's important to suspend judgment for a second and try and dig a little bit and figure out what's going on. So this would be the same thing I would say in management training when companies say, hey, how do we tell someone who's not ready yet for a role that they're not ready yet? Because both sides, right? Maybe you really aren't ready. I don't know. But in either end of either end of that situation, whatever party it is, it's having the conversation about, okay, what are the next things I need to do? What are the steps? What are the pieces that I'm missing? And actually having a conversation about it. Because it can be really easy to let ego get in the way. And that's when you want to do the thing, as we said, of like, goodbye, see you never. But instead, having a conversation about what are the things that I need to be working on and what are the steps that I need to do? Okay, if X, Y, and Z is a skill, what do I need to do to prove that I've mastered that so that you can start working on it, opposed to letting your hurt feelings and frustration get in the way.
Makes sense. So what about millennials who are in management and they're managing people in other generations?
Uh-huh.
What do you tell them? Like, what sort of issues are they experiencing, and what are some solutions or advice you offer?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's actually entire programs that people run on generational differences within the office, which I think is super fascinating. But in terms of millennials if they're managing people from older generations, I think going in any management situation, I would say understand what the person needs, right? Part of your job as a manager is managing them in the way that they need it to be. And so while you can assume certain things about, I really love feedback this certain way, actually sitting down with any new person you're managing saying, hey, what's your kind of preferred work style in terms of ask about logistic expectations. So most pain comes from mismatch in expectations. So if your manager expects you to be getting in at 9 on the dot and you thought it was like a 9 to 9:30 flexible thing, neither of you is wrong. You just never had this conversation. And so it's going to be a butting of heads. So if they're managing someone from another generation, the same thing would apply of sitting down and saying, logistically, what kind of things you need. When it comes to communication, what works best for you? When it comes to the work that we're working on, what are the things, that you expect to be covering, and having it be a two-way conversation so that you can learn what they need. And so if there is a generational gap of, I need feedback in really specific times opposed to ongoing, then you can know that and you can set it up in a way that's going to work for you too.
Okay. Now, on to you, Chris. So I'd love to hear about your own career success and when you pivoted. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah. So originally, I am from the advertising industry. So I worked at an agency, at my peak, as I call it. I worked at an agency in SF. I worked on the Google account. It was, again, perfect on paper, all of those things. And for me, I often explain it as the whisper that turns into a scream. And that's something that a lot of people who I chat with identify with, of this thing that you're like, I'm not sure if I want to do this. And you're like, shh, and you push it down and you ignore it. And then it gets louder and louder until you're like, okay, I understand. I need to do something about this. And so, that whisper that turns into a scream was definitely what it was for me, of this doubts about, I liked the work that I was doing. I loved the people who I got to work with. It was a great company, everything about it. And yet I wasn't sure that it was the kind of work I wanted to be doing. And so for me, it was very much this interesting process where I had started training our desktop team. I was a specialized mobile planner. And so I had started training our desktop team on how to do the work that I was doing, because there was 2 of us and a lot more of the other people. And so we had to train them on it. And that's when I got my first exposure to training, fell in love with it. And for me, it was really that process of, I want to do more of that, and taking a bunch of little steps so that I moved over the course of about a year from mobile planning to talent development and culture, and have been in professional development ever since.
Okay. Well, we're glad that you're here.
Yes, I love it.
So it's a job seekers market, and a lot of employers are learning this. And so when you're thinking about interviewing, one of the things that I always tell my clients is it's just as important for you to assess the organization as it is for them to assess you.
Yes.
So when you're talking to your clients in their interviewing process, are you talking about the fact that it's a job seekers market? And if so, how what are you telling them about assessing the employer?
Yeah, so 100%. I'm totally with you. That is that same conversation of you're looking for a mutual two-way fit, right? A good career is like a good relationship. You don't want to go in just being like, whatever you want.
That's what I say too.
yeah. Because the problem is then if someone signs on to that, if you're putting on this act while you're interviewing and you're not asking them any hard questions, but you're putting on an act of whatever I can do to make you like me, then if you get hired, it's kind of a bad situation because then you're going to be having to play that role forever. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be really exhausting. And it's taking a lot of time away from doing great work. And so we absolutely talk about that. I always work on actually making your checklist, building your interview questions to make sure you know what you're getting into beforehand. Because if people ever say to me, I didn't realize what I was getting into until 3 months in, that is just an interviewing problem. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, but you got to do a better job then.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, how do you envision the future of work?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think for the future of work, the biggest thing that I see, again, coming from the cultural space within companies, and especially in the role that I do now, getting to see so many interactions with so many different companies that my clients have. I think the future is really moving towards the continuation of this empowerment. And even when it's not a job seekers market anymore, I think some of these expectations of a company has to be willing to have these conversations is still going to hold true. Because even when it's still really competitive, people are going to want to be able to ask questions about, no, I want to know how you treat your employees beforehand so that this isn't a surprise once I get in there. And to me, I definitely see that as a lot of the companies who maybe have some, say, more dated practices is what we can call them, but more of those things of like, you just show up, butts in seats, no flexibility. I think those are starting to see the impact of the millennial workforce having slightly different expectations because they're naturally, people are gravitating towards more of the companies where they can have that kind of life. So it's really forcing companies to change, which is really fun.
And I'm enjoying watching it as well too. I'm enjoying watching the process happen. So I'm so excited that you were a guest on our show today. I would love if you would let anyone who's listening know, where can they find you and what are you up to over there? What are you doing these days?
What am I doing? So you can pretty much find me on social everywhere at Empowered Achievers. My website is Be Empowered Achievers. For the most part, any of those places, LinkedIn, send a carrier pigeon, you'll be able to find it. Pretty easy to find. But in terms of what I'm up to, the main thing is just continually working on. So right now we're in our last cohort of Career Clarity Camp for 2018, which is really fun. And it's just a small group that we have taking people through all those 5 pillars that I mentioned to actually get clear on what's next for them in their roles. So that's the main thing that I'm working on right now is finishing out the year with that and getting ready for our next one, which is 2019, which I can't believe it's already almost here. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay. So I want to do something with you that I do with each of our guests, and it's flash questions. This is the way that we wrap up our show. So I'm going to ask you 3 different questions, and I would love if you would tell me the first thing that comes to mind, okay? Okay, first question. It's never too late to
decide again.
Oh, that was deep. Okay. Second question. I get inspired by
Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck. She's a professor of psychology at Stanford. She wrote the book on the growth mindset. She's the best. I love her.
I need to check that out. Okay.
I know that's not a very flash answer, but
no, this was perfect. Okay. And last question. Career success means?
Career success means success to you, not success to someone else.
Oh, what a great way to wrap up the show. So, Chris, thank you for being a part of the show, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so great to chat with you. Thanks, Jennifer.
I hope you enjoyed today's show. Be sure to tune in next week because we have so much more in store for you. Until next time, keep going, keep growing, and keep glowing.